Donald Trump plays to his base with renewed attacks on border crossers and says he'll have troops patrolling the southern border. Record high rents have even people with advanced degrees living in their cars in San Diego. And a program designed in the 60s to integrate schools has unintended consequences these days. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Kate Morrissey, who covers immigration for the San Diego Union-Tribune, Amitha Sharma, California Dream Project reporter for KPBS, KPBS education reporter Megan Burks, and Michael Smolens, columnist for the Union-Tribune. Well, Donald Trump ramped up his battle this week against immigrants and what he calls weak immigration laws. Trump's latest plans send the military to patrol the border till his promised wall gets built. Could be a while since he just signed a budget deal in which Congress appropriated a pittance for Trump's wall, and Mexico flat out isn't paying for it, as Trump promised at scores of campaign rallies. So, Kate, what seems to have prompted this latest gambit from the president?
So there's an annual caravan of migrants that's sort of a demonstration about people's right to request asylum when they're afraid of persecution or other things in their home country. And so this caravan sort of got picked up in the news, and the president became aware of it. And it's larger than it's been in past years. At its largest, it was somewhere around 1,200, maybe a little bit more. And he got very concerned about the size of it and the fact that it was headed this way. So he sort of ramped up his rhetoric about his immigration policy. All
right, we'll get into some more details about that. But Trump tweeted this week that illegal border crossings are at actually a 46-year low. And we've stated that on this show many times, that it really has been relatively low in recent years. NPR reported that figure in December, and he took credit, of course. But why the sudden urgency now to send troops to the border, and how many troops are we talking about?
You know, it's interesting. In December, when we were all covering that story, they also did a big press conference where they had the heads of the agencies involved in immigration enforcement speaking about the numbers. And while they celebrated the low, which is it's a long time trend, you know, if you look back at the graph, it's a very distinct downward trend. But they were also at the same time still voicing concern and asking for more money and more resources and all these things, and particularly talking about arriving families and unaccompanied children who they were seeing at the border. So even at that time, we heard a lot of this, and this week has been sort of a return to that call for Congress to change some laws, particularly regarding those groups of people arriving. And in your story this week, you said the president could be prevented from putting these guard troops at the border by Governor Brown. How's that work? Right. So most of the time, the governor is responsible for the state's National Guard. The president can call them up for federal duty overseas, but on our soil, it's generally the governor's decision what the National Guard does. If there's some kind of insurrection or actual violent thing happening, there have been instances where the president has sent in the National Guard. But in this case, the precedent and what we've seen happen in the past is that governors agree to send National Guard to the border in support of Border Patrol. And that's what Trump has said he's in the process of asking for now. So it would be up to Governor Brown. And I guess the governors are mulling that at this point. Well, Mike, I wanted to ask you about the political aspects of this for Governor Brown in California. How does this play in the other border states?
Well, for Governor Brown, I mean, he actually sort of the adult in the room. He, compared to other Democrats in California, has been a little more restrained in his criticism of the president. He's been very critical, but he's not up for re-election. You've just got this competition among Democrats in California, particularly the ones that are up for election or seeking higher office. They're trying to, there's a competition who can be tougher in their rhetoric on the president. Attorney General Becerra has filed, I think, 29 lawsuits against the Trump administration. He's up for election. It's not to say there's nothing any of those are illegitimate, but it's a lot. I mean, it's like half or more than half of what Texas did during the Obama administration. So, and we're hardly even to that point yet. But I think that the bigger thing is, what is Trump doing? Kate sort of outlined things. There was a little uptick in border arrests, but there's nothing dramatic. And I think we're getting used to finally, although it's hard to stop hyperventilating with this president because he likes that. He operates on chaos and creates chaos when he can and looks for a crisis. And we've learned over the decades there's probably no easier crisis for a president to create than an immigration one. That's one that quickly, it's easy to understand. It works politically.
There's always some people going to be coming over the border.
What's interesting is usually when that happens, there's an economic downturn or there's a real huge spike, some trend. You don't see any of those things.
Well, this week, was it Ann Coulter got upset with him and Fox News pundits were coming at him from the right and he was thinking the base was getting shaky? Was it literally a political stunt?
It's politics is always involved. I can't say what exactly motivated him. There's been reporting that, sort of the moderating forces within his administration, it's sort of hard to believe there were any the way he operates, are sort of, most of those are gone except for a few, and so he's either his own counsel as always, or the real hardliners on a number of issues have his ear. But that's just sort of the way he operates. I think he likes to keep people constantly on edge. He thinks it works to his benefit.
Go ahead, Kate.
To bounce off what he was saying, the story that came out yesterday about the uptick in apprehensions in March of this year and how we're seeing an increase at the border in sort of more recent months. It came on the tail end of this whole week of tweeting and all of the different comments that he's been making. And, the Department of Homeland Security put out this big statement about this is why we need all this legislation. And it's that same pattern that we saw in December when they were making those statements. And that was around the time that there was a lot of negotiation over a potential DACA bill. There was, are we going to attach it to the spending bill or not? And it was that week when we were all sort of really watching whether that was going to happen that this same conversation came out. So it's not the first time.
But the National Guard has been sent to the border before. President Obama did it, and I believe Bush did it as well.
Clinton did too. We were talking about that incident in '97, right? In
so
Texas.
that was the Marines. But yes, both Bush and Obama sent National Guard to support the Border Patrol. They were on a specific mission to help Border Patrol during a hiring push. So the idea was we're going to have them here for a set number of years, and during those years, we're going to increase Border Patrol by this many people so that we don't need them anymore. And it would allow Border Patrol agents themselves to do some of that hiring work as well as to be more on the front line at the border where they can make arrests, because the National Guard couldn't actually make arrests when they were at the border. They were simply in supporting roles, monitoring cameras, doing different work like that.
So what has Mexico's reaction to this been?
Mexico, as with many of these things, has not been in favor. When the announcement first came out, they were asking for clarification. What's going on? We haven't heard about this. In the past, when National Guard was sent to the border, my understanding is that there was a lot of conversation with Mexico beforehand about what was going to happen, and that wasn't the case before this announcement was made. So, and then they've since come out against.
And the president has condemned Trump's rhetoric this week here and made a very forceful statement just yesterday. I did want to play a bite we have from Trump talking about this caravan that you explained and what he has to say about it.
So we are preparing for the military to secure our border between Mexico and the United States. We have a meeting on it in a little while with General Mattis and everybody, and I think that it's something we have to do. Now, the caravan, which is over 1,000 people coming in from Honduras, thought they were going to just walk right through Mexico and right through the border.
Well, these folks are seeking asylum, right? They're leaving horrible conditions in their home country.
Yes, at least a portion of them. The ones who the caravan intends to bring all the way to the U.S. border will be asylum seekers. I understand that there may have been some others who wanted to support the march in its earlier phases.
All right, and Michael, and on getting back to the political note, tied up in all this is threats from President Trump saying, well, we're just going to arbitrarily pull out of NAFTA here in response to all this, and we're going to get tough on that. That has all sorts of political problems for him, does it not, in certain states that he carried?
Well, it is. It's interesting that you bring that up because things shift all the time, and he's been threatening to do that since the campaign, and they're in negotiations. There's been some reporting, and we'll see how, what ultimately happens, but that the administration's kind of scrambling to come to a deal, some thinking that despite him saying that, it would be better off without NAFTA, a lot of people truly believe that's not the case. Certainly out here on the West Coast, and particularly us in San Diego, that would be a big economic problem for us. So, again, just sort of trying to figure out what is really going on with his rhetoric and bombast versus what they're actually doing, trying to negotiate, is hard to tell. But there are discussions going on, and they seem to, there does seem to be some anxiety in the administration, according to some reports, to try to get something done.
So President Trump is saying that that he wants to pull out of NAFTA as punishment to Mexico. Who would be worse off if the U.S. pulled out of NAFTA, the U.S. or Mexico?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there would be pain on both sides, and there'd be a problem on the northern border with Canada, because that would sort of just scuttle the whole treaty. Again, we'll have to see, do they scuttle it and try to bring in something new, or just rework this? There's going to have to be some agreement between, the United States and Mexico at some point, or it would be real chaos, I think.
Before we leave this segment, I did want to get to the whole idea of Trump's rhetoric here. I mean, he falsely claimed that Democrats want to open the border, let in criminals and drugs flow in. He claimed with no evidence that women in this caravan we've been talking about were being raped with shocking frequency. Millions voted illegally in California again, and he actually won the vote. How does he get away with this stuff? How does he get away with these statements constantly?
I don't know that that's something I can necessarily answer. I think those of us who are reporting in this area are fact-checking claims made by everyone, including the president, on it, and it's a question of what Americans are consuming in terms of who they believe on.
Michael, is it the theater?
I think it's hard. He's the president of the United States, and we report what the president says. His words are very important. Just about everybody in my lifetime, everybody else has been far more measured and at least has some sense of the truth and reality. He does not on a lot of these things. That particular one about all these women being raped on the Caravan, that one really sort of struck me. I sort of thought, at what point do we in the media, report something that is so unsubstantiated? And there are people with the Caravan that report that they're not reporting that. So, again, I think that it's hard to judge, but he always seems to ramp it up when things aren't going well for him. And let's mention, he didn't get much wall funding. A lot of things on the immigration front really aren't necessarily working in his favor. He's doing an awful lot with the markets, and with the China and the tariffs and so forth. Right. I think he gets a little frustrated, and particularly you also mentioned the criticism from the right. He starts acting this way.
Well, we're out of time on this, but I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about as we move ahead in the weeks to come. We're going to move on now. It's almost a cliche of hard times. Highly educated people working menial jobs and living in cars or on the street. Now, Mitha, you reported on one man in this very situation, though the economy is strong and near full employment. Tell us about him and how you learned about him.
Well, Chad Bordas is 46 years old. He has an MBA, and up until this past week, he was living in his car. Because the room that he was renting for $750 a month in a home in Encinitas was being sold. And he drives Uber, he drives Lyft, he works at an online car sales company, and he makes between $2,000 to $2,400 a month. And he has a loan payment on his MBA of about $1,300 a month. So he is at the financial edge. He has been applying for jobs for several months now in California. He just moved from Oregon, and he's not getting any bites. He's applying locally in San Diego County, and he said he's not even getting calls back from entry-level jobs at $36,000 a year. And the way I heard about him is I had done a story last month about this shrinking middle class in California. It had gone from 60% in 1970 to now 50%. And I ended the story with a quote from an urbanist who said that, yes, the shrinking middle class is a bad thing, but what's even more frightening is that we now have college-educated people who are working at Starbucks or driving Uber and barely making it. So this man happened to hear that story and called me, and I said, I'm that guy, because he drives Uber, he drives Lyft. He's working 3 jobs. So what we did is we shadowed him
a day in the life.
For a day. So he's living out of his car, was living out of his car in a parking lot in Encinitas. And we got there at 3:30 in the morning, we got there at 3. But he woke up at 3:30 in the morning And at 3:45 a.m., he was out the parking lot, goes to get gas. At 4 a.m., he starts looking at Uber and Lyft ride requests. At 4:30, he gets a bite. He goes to pick up a couple in northern San Diego County, drives down to the airport, drives back up, goes to take a shower, and then at 7:30 leaves to start his next shift selling cars online. At 3 p.m. he leaves that, and then he goes and drives Uber and Lyft until about 8 o'clock at night. And we interviewed him sometime in between then, and then at 8:30 he goes to bed. So he's working a 17-hour shift.
And again, the economy's relatively good. You wonder, the guy with an MBA, what happens in a downturn?
But the premise of that middle class story was, look, there are not a lot of middle income jobs that are left in California. And he is a guy who's saying he is actually finding that. So it turns out that he found a room to live in a house. And I interviewed him yesterday about that. And I said, so, you know, how'd you find the room? I found it on Craigslist. Describe the room. It's about 8 feet by 8 feet. It's a laundry room, but it has a closet and it has windows and it's a place to rest my head. I said, so do you think you might end up living in your car? How stable do you feel? And he said, it depends on the person whose house I'm renting, whether they move. So it is, and I am on a month-to-month lease. And so I could very well end up back in my car.
Back in a month. No, go ahead, Kate.
So is there a reason why his student loans are so high? Because my understanding is there's a way, if you only make a certain amount, that you can apply for them to lower your monthly payments.
I think he's gone through several rounds of that because he has had an unstable work situation, and I think, you know, he's worked pretty hard at getting it deferred, and I don't know the ins and outs of all of that, but I do know that he has had it deferred a couple of times. But it just seems like everything that he's got going on is pretty overwhelming for him financially.
And your story this week coincided with a story about the average rent in San Diego County hit a record $1,887 here.
Right. So he was telling me that, look, I just don't make enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. He had looked around, and it would be about $1,500. And for a one-bedroom now, since those numbers came out, it's about $1,700.
We have a bite from him. I want to hear a word from him. Let's hear what he says.
How do we get here? You know, how do we get to a point where we devalue human life? You know, to where, you know, it's okay if we step over homeless people, or, you know, if you're sleeping in your car, it doesn't matter. You know, life's tough. Get over it. You know, why aren't there more houses being built for lower income families? And what are they doing about, you know, the job? Like, what kind of job creation are they doing here? So what are we doing to bring more jobs in?
I should add before you go that those questions were a series of questions that he had after I said, look, if you had your elected representatives in front of you, what would you ask them? And those were the questions.
And those are questions we'll continue to talk about on this show. I wanted to do a step back because this is part of the multi-station collaboration, the California Dream Project. Remind us what that's about and some of the things that you're learning now as you do these stories.
So the California Dream Project has taken a group of public media reporters across the state to look at where the California Dream has been, where it is right now, where it's going, through the lens of many of these issues: housing, employment, transportation, lots of data. And I myself will be covering wealth and poverty. And what I've learned so far is that Californians are struggling. You know, in talking to Chad and some other people, I feel like some of the state's poorest residents are in a unhealthy, abusive almost relationship with California because they want to stay here. They want to continue to live here. And they're doing everything they can. They're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They're cramming themselves in with their parents or other families.
Whatever they can do.
But what is the state doing to keep them here? I don't know that the state's doing much. And I asked Chad, well, why don't you leave? But you know, I love Encinitas. I love the weather here. I love the people here.
Well, we'll look forward to more stories as we move along in our project. Well, it was born a half-century ago in the civil rights era, the magnet school. The idea was to attract white students to predominantly black schools, but these days magnets can actually fuel racial isolation. That seems to be playing out in Vista. And Megan, just start with kind of the definition. What are we talking about when we say magnet school?
So a magnet school is a district-run public school. Unlike other schools where there's an enrollment boundary, it has no enrollment boundary because its explicit goal is to bring students to a particular part of town. And like you said, it started as a way to bring racial diversity to a particular campus. More and more schools are using it to help spur teaching innovation. And I'm also seeing districts use it to kind of hold on to families that may choose a private school or a charter school, because these magnets tend to have a very kind of flashy focus, very specialized curriculum.
All right, tell us about the particular school you looked at in Vista. What was it, and what did it become?
So the school in Vista that we focused on, it's highly coveted in this community. It's called the Vista Innovation Design Academy, or VITA for short. It used to be Washington Middle School. It's in Central Vista, where some of the poorest census tracts in Vista are. Previously, the school was 83% Latino, and they were scoring pretty low on their tests. They were constantly on California's list of the bottom 10% of schools. So it definitely needed a change. It did need more diversity. The problem now is that it's so coveted. Parents with means are applying to get their kids into this school, and now it's actually overrepresentative of white students.
Okay, we do have a bit of a promotional video about what VITA is all about. Let's hear that.
We will spark the inquisitive nature of students,
encouraging them to individually and collaboratively explore and create through the design thinking process.
We believe they can be problem finders and solution designers because we believe in the creative capacity of all students.
All right, well, that sounds terrific, but what about the students who are in the neighborhood and now have to kind of go long distances to school, right?
Right, so there are kids who maybe used to live across the street from what was Washington Middle School. If they were already going to Washington, they were grandfathered in and could continue going, but these younger generations were rezoned to schools that are much further away. They're more than 2 miles away, which is kind of the standard for how close you want a school to be to children. So they have to hop on the bus and go to these traditional schools. They can enter the lottery, but the data that we looked at shows that many of these students, who again are predominantly low income, predominantly Latino, are not either entering or not being successful in the lottery.
Michael?
Megan, I read your piece. I enjoyed it. It was interesting that you talked about federal grants and how some of the focus has changed. There was, as Mark in the setup talked about, magnet schools hoping to bring diversity and integration. I think, if I read it correctly, that a lot of the focus has changed to innovation. And of course, the schools have been criticized across the country and in California for not keeping up and so forth. So that seems to be the thrust. Are these like two kind of conflicting goals to integrate, and yet we want to have the innovation, and somehow that one upsets the other?
Yeah, well, I spoke with a civil rights expert on this. She's been studying segregation for 30 years, and she said that a lot of school administrators say, we've been talking about integration for so long. We've been talking about it from the 60s. Surely we've had some successes there. Let's focus on innovation. Let's focus on bringing up test scores, that sort of thing. So she kind of described it as a fatigue, that people don't really want to talk about racial isolation anymore. The problem is that if you don't monitor demographic shifts, things can get out of control and off balance pretty quickly. And we know that racial diversity in schools actually improves academic outcomes.
Namitha?
So what percentage of this school's kids are actually neighborhood kids?
I don't have that data. It's hard to tell, but I do know that the school district, at the time that it started VITA, it was losing a lot of kids to other districts and to charter schools. So it put an emphasis on bringing kids into the Vista Unified School District. So it actually set aside 25% of its spots for transfers. So at least 25% of the school, probably more, because their siblings are allowed to come from outside of Vista. From there, each different enrollment zone can bring in students that may be those local students.
We've got about a minute left, but I wanted to ask about reaction from parents of students who were there at the school and now to these changes with VITA.
So similar to what you were covering, a lot of these parents work multiple jobs. So I had a lot of trouble getting in touch with people. I left letters in Spanish and English at school bus stops. These kids take the city bus actually to school. And it was just, I found one parent and she said that the commute to the new school was a burden. It was actually a financial burden as well because she has to now, instead of her child walking across the street, has to pay $36 a month for a city bus pass. So it is a burden, but it was very hard to quantify and really get to that angle of the story because this population is low income and these parents are busy just like every parent, but they have the added struggle of, maybe having a couple extra jobs.
All right, we're about out of time, but I mean, it's a fascinating thing, and I imagine this is probably playing out at other magnet schools, and we could look at other situations across the city and the county. Interesting stuff, very interesting stories this week. Well, I appreciate it from all of you, and we are out of time. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Kate Morrissey of the San Diego Union Tribune, Amitha Sharma of KPBS News, KPBS education reporter Megan Burks, and Michael Smolens, columnist with the San Diego Union Tribune. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being with us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.